this works. So first of all, I just wanted to thank the organizers for inviting me. Salam has been an idol almost for a long time now, and I really appreciate the opportunity to pay a tribute to him. On a completely separate note, I don't know what possessed me yesterday to update my presentation software, and so it has completely messed up all my quotes. It's sort of either showing that or not. I have no idea what's going on. So some of the things I'm just going to have to wing them. I didn't want to write all the quotations down, and now I'm kind of wishing I had. Anyway, so the talk is basically life lessons from Abdus Salam, because I figured there's so many people in the audience who know Professor Salam, have worked with him. I actually never met him. So there's a limited amount that I could say about him. And since my field of study is not, phenomenology either, there's not much I can say specifically about his work. So this is a more general thing. And I think it's sort of relevant with the background that I come from, because in the developing world, I'm from Pakistan, as was mentioned in the introduction, there are still so many problems that Salam brought up that are still very relevant. Decades later, there are things that he worked on that, the status of them has absolutely not changed. So that's one thing. And then another is that he dealt with a lot of the challenges that I think face young scientists everywhere. And I think his was a great example of how to start from very, what he called, humble beginnings and reach the absolute top. And I think it's, just instructive to see how one does that and try and emulate what we can. So I came to know Salam very gradually. Even though I grew up in Pakistan, I was dimly aware of him, but he lived overseas, and also, it's no secret, I suppose, that the Pakistani government was not exactly very friendly and did not give him his due. So he wasn't really someone who was mentioned a lot. And so there was that, and there was also, to be honest, the fact that the physics he worked on was not really something that a lot of my high school teachers would know about. So it's not really something that we were familiar with. So I came to know him through a series of, I went to the ICTP, then I studied his physics, then I started reading what he had written, so I became more and more involved over a period of time. And this is what's actually the only thing I've written down. This is something that I wanted to start with because I think it's very instructive in the sense that we, growing up in Pakistan, almost thought of Professor Salam the way he was told 4-5 decades earlier to think about the weak force. So he narrated this incident. He said that when he was in school in 1936, his teacher gave them a lecture about the forces of nature. And he started with gravity, which of course everyone knew, it's familiar, you know what it was. Then he went on to say, well, electricity. And there is a force called electricity, but it doesn't live in Chang. Chang was the village where Salam grew up. It lives in Lahore, which is 100 miles to the east. So, electricity was something that did not live in Jung. Apparently, gravity did. And then this teacher had just heard about the nuclear force. And he said, the nuclear force only exists in Europe. And so he told his students not to worry about it. So to a certain extent, that was, kind of our relationship with Abdus Salam. He existed somewhere in Europe, and we didn't worry too much about him. But the more I came to discover him, and I think that started with my year at the ICTP, the more I came to worry about him. And I don't want to overstate the case, because when Salam worried about the weak force, he ended up winning a Nobel Prize for it. When I started worrying about Salam, I did not exactly reach that kind of level of achievement, but I did, I think, learn certain lessons that I would, in the spirit of what Salam did, I would like to pass on. This is something that I've always found very fascinating. The soul is dyed the color of its thoughts. And what you do day by day is what you become. That's something that I believe in. I think that, especially as theoretical physicists, or anyone who works deeply with an idea, it's something that you turn around in your head all day. Those thoughts end up influencing you. They become a part of you. In order to do these things well, you have to internalize all of these concepts that you're holding, and you create a sort of a thought structure in your mind. And it can't help but influence everything else that you do. And so I wanted to see if we could get some kind of a lens on Salam and his life through his physics and see, if there were any parallels. Obviously, that's not a very rigorous exercise, but I thought it might be fun to use some of the language of physics. So starting out with the standard model Lagrangian, which I'm assuming is familiar to almost everyone here. As physicists, we like Lagrangians. We like them because, well, for a bunch of reasons, but mainly because I think they give us the equations of motion. And equations of motion tell you how a system evolves, which is really what we want out of science in the first place. I mean, everything that we're trying to understand, one way that we know things are working is that we're able to make predictions that are then verified. So if we do not understand how a system evolves in time, we're not able to make predictions. So the equations of motion give us that kind of understanding and that kind of control almost over a system. And the Lagrangian leads to them, which is fabulous. Okay, now we've missed out on something there. Well, Salam worked on gauge theories, and gauge theories are increasingly, I think, found to be some of the most important theories. And, all four of the fundamental, three of the fundamental forces are formulated as gauge theories. I think calling gravity that is maybe still a moot point. And so to write the Lagrangian down, you need to know the symmetries, because what you want to put down in the Lagrangian are invariant quantities. So you want to only work with things that are invariant under these gauge symmetries or redundancies of the description of a system. So I kind of, we have the Lagrangian for the standard model. We can work out all sorts of things about it. I kind of wish every once in a while that there was a Lagrangian like that for life, so that you could figure out what's going to happen next. And so this talk is kind of a playful attempt to do that. So in order to do that, I want to sort of look back and see what the symmetries are, what the invariances are. And by the invariants, I mean things in Salam's life that continued, so overarching themes, and also themes that we can pick out and that would apply to any one of us. So obviously his own personal circumstances were unique only to him, but there are many things that can be lifted out of his life and apply. So in that sense, they're invariants. Okay, this is just a slight physics joke in that there are symmetries, and then the symmetries that you put into the Lagrangian every once in a while, there are these accidental symmetries that occur. And I couldn't help but notice when I was looking through the photographs that this is Salam when he was 14 years old, and he came first in the matriculation exams, which was a very big deal because it was something like 29,000 students from all across an entire huge province, and he was from this little school in a small village. So he came first, and this was the photograph that appeared in the local paper. And this is Salam when he... Okay. Sorry, I have no idea why that's happening. Okay. When he won the Nobel Prize, and this picture, I'm guessing, is more familiar. There's an obvious symmetry here. I kind of think it's accidental. He's wearing turbans in both these pictures. Now, people in Pakistan do not go around wearing turbans every single day. So this is more of an accident than it appears. And it turns out that there's this very sweet anecdote, I thought, that when he got the result for the matriculation exam, he had just one day before gone to get his head shaved. And the barber had shaved it too close, and he did not want to expose his head. So he was going around wearing a turban. So that explains the first one. The second one was a lot more deliberate, because I think he wanted to make a statement about his roots and his identity. But again, that was kind of funny, because no one wears a turban every single day. So he decided he wanted to do it, but he didn't know how. And apparently, there was major chaos until I think the cook or some, person in the Pakistani embassy, I'm pretty sure it was the cook, had to be called and he had to tie the turban for him. So, whatever. Regardless, there is this symmetry sort of connecting the two ends of his life. This is not the kind of symmetry we will be talking about, though. Okay, so drawing lessons from his life, one of the first things I would say is cultivate a wide intellectual curiosity. That might seem like a strange place to start, but I think that is what gave Salam his unique edge. So we have a lot of brilliant scientists, but the way that Salam was able to do so many things and literally be a one-man, it was like a one-man corporation almost, the things that he was juggling and managing. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that he was deeply and widely intellectually curious. He read on all sorts of subjects. Again, this is something that I've discovered recently, but apparently he had books on everything from ballroom dancing to how to fly a plane. He read about the Marx Brothers, he read P.G. Wodehouse, he was very familiar with Punjabi poetry. Punjabi is the dialect of the province he was from. So he knew a very wide range of things and he was familiar with them. And I think a lot of times, especially in the developing world, those of us who study the natural sciences miss out on the humanities. We don't focus on them nearly as much. In my personal opinion, that's a little bit of a mistake because that's what enables us to reach out and make connections to people. And I think that serves Salam very well. So other than the fact that it just makes you an interesting person to talk to, and it's nice to know what else is going on in the world, I think it's also one of the things that gave him his unique edge. Then there is the fact that, he was able to find a way to honor his roots, but he didn't let that hold him back. The turban at the Nobel Prize, I think, is the most obvious form of him honoring his roots. But he continued to go back to Pakistan every time he was called, despite the fact that he was treated very, very shabbily by the government. He went back and he listened. I heard this interview that someone did in Punjabi, which again is the regional dialect. Now, people who speak Punjabi are not necessarily very highly educated. So he would go back and do things like that. He gave an entire 2-hour interview in the local dialect so that people, from his region could understand things, people who might not be necessarily conversant in the national language, Urdu, and definitely not English. So he never became too big to go back and do that. And this was post the Nobel Prize. This was late 80s. And the interviewer was asking very, very basic questions. It was a 2-hour interview. I cringed at times just listening to it. But he went on very patiently, very graciously answering all the questions. So, that sense of honoring where you come from, even if it is a humble thing, and never growing too large for it. But on the other hand, not letting that hold you back either. So one of the decisions that he had to make, which I think was probably one of the most difficult decisions of his life, was to leave Pakistan because he did love the place, but he did not have the facilities there that he needed. And so he made that choice. I think he realized that there's no point sinking with a sinking ship and that you can help many more people even if you're at a distance. And again, a lot of us from a certain part of the world, we feel that tug even today. I mean, speaking from my own personal experience, I know there are so many times when we still struggle with that question of, am I abandoning my country? What am I doing by leaving? And I think that, if there is a way to stay and if there is a way to contribute, one should definitely do that. But on the other hand, one also needs to make sure that one is able to contribute in the first place. It's kind of like what they tell you on the planes that, put your own mask on before you help others. Initially, I used to think that was very selfish advice until I, sat down and thought about it. And you realize that, well, if you try and put someone else's mask on and you're dying, you might just kill them as well. So you don't want to take people down with you. You don't want to just disappear for no reason at all. And so, there are ways and ways of contributing. And Salam, I think, was able to negotiate that very well. And I think he's a very good role model for that also. Then there is the fact that one should be open to change. One should, I think, view life as a conversation. The people you meet, you should let them influence you. You should have that sort of openness. And I think that worked for Salam because he, like people mentioned in the morning as well, and I think is common knowledge, he started out wanting to join the Indian civil service, or being told that he would join the civil service, and he went abroad just for a while. He started studying mathematics, and the reason he did that was because you could score very high marks in mathematics. It's one of those subjects where it's possible to score a perfect, to have a perfect score, and that he thought would give him the competitive edge in the exams. So that's how it started. But he went there, and he didn't just go there with this sort of single-minded, closed approach. He went, he started talking to people. Dirac influenced him a great deal, and the more he saw these ideas, the more he responded to them, he decided that physics is what he wanted to do. And again, that's something that comes from a certain degree of openness. You have to be able to explore other opportunities. Then this, I think, is also something that makes Salam extremely special, in that he always acknowledged his debts. Even to the school teacher in Chang, who taught him in this very modest government school, even towards the end of his life, he arranged for laboratory equipment to be sent there. He arranged for books to be sent to the library. So again, he never wanted to sever his ties. And a lot of people end up doing that when they think they've become very grand. They don't necessarily want to acknowledge where they're from. He never did that. He publicly acknowledged his debts to his school teacher. Every time he went back to Lahore, he would go back to his professors who taught him at Government College and Punjab University. He would go and call on them. So he gave them that sense of knowing what they had done, knowing that they had contributed to making him who he was. And that, I think, is something that's important to do. And he was deeply loyal. He was able to be loyal to so many different institutions. He was loyal to Government College. I think in 87, 89, something like that. It was the 150th anniversary of Government College. Now, by this time, Salam is obviously, he's won the Nobel Prize, he's running the ICTP, he has a lot of other things to do. But he used to write for the college magazine when he was a student there. And he still found the time to contribute to that edition of the magazine. He was the editor, incidentally, of both the English and the Urdu sections, which is quite rare because most people are not equally at ease in both. So he found the time to do that. He was loyal to Cambridge. He was loyal to St. John's College. I think most of you have probably heard that incident where he was offered a fellowship at Trinity, and he said that he would stay at St. John's. And the thing that's always quoted is that he said, well, the roses here are beautiful, I don't want to leave. And I saw that everywhere, except in one place, there is this little additional anecdote that his brother asked him, it's a much more prestigious college, why aren't you going there? And he said, well, the roses here are beautiful. And then he added, and there is also something known as loyalty. So there is something to be said for nurturing institutions. Not that Cambridge really needed to be nurtured, but as a general principle, when an institution gives you something, you give back. That's how you build things. That's how you grow. Imperial College took a chance on him. I think he repaid that manyfold. He was true to it to the end. Even when he wasn't living there, even while he was running the ICTP, he still found a way to be loyal to Imperial College. And loyal to British science in general. There was this wonderful article that I was reading. I don't remember exactly what the context was, but some particle physics funding was being cut by the British government. I don't remember the year. And he wrote this very impassioned plea, and it started by, British science cannot cut out something that it started. And he went back, he traced the history, and he sort of fought for it as if it was his own thing. He was able to do the same thing in Italy. So all of these things he was able to subsume in his self and be loyal to each and every one of them and not have conflicting loyalty. Somehow he sort of unified them and carried them together. Then Resilience is another thing that I think a lot of, especially younger people starting out in the sciences, have a hard time with. Definitely people in developing countries have a hard time with, because even though I wish it was otherwise, there is still this attitude of like a conventional student-teacher relationship. You don't necessarily ask questions, which might be stupid questions. So, there is this, it's not necessarily very easy to speak out, ask all sorts of outlandish questions. And Salam, I think, has been quoted multiple times since the morning, found a way of doing that. He was intensely resilient. Apparently, he used a group of peers after Pauli convinced him to not write up the neutrino theory that I think he was upset about probably till the end. He decided that he incorporated that into his worldview, and he decided he would just throw out ideas. And one way of doing that, so he wasn't completely responsible about it, he set up a peer group at Imperial, and apparently he would just bounce off ideas at lunch, just talk to people, and they would take his ideas apart. A lot of them would just be completely dismissed, and he would come back the next day with more. So, that adage about if the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas, he kept doing that. He kept, throwing out ideas and being endlessly creative and resilient. When things failed, he just went back and did more. So I'm kind of running out of time, so I'll just run through this quickly. But we kind of touched upon this before when I said he spoke to people in their own language. He did that, with the people from his village. He did that no matter which audience he was speaking to. So in this article that he wrote for this British paper, he quoted P.G. Wodehouse. So he always had like that little cultural thing which rooted him, which made people feel, yes, he knows. He was able to make that connection. And he was very conscious of doing that. I've read a lot of his addresses. That's actually in that book, Ideals and Realities, which I also highly recommend. He went to Turkey, he would quote examples from Turkey. When he went to Bangladesh, he would quote examples from their history. So he always had a sense of, he made people feel he was buying in. He knew what they were about. Then there is this giving yourself a fighting chance. So a lot of times, one has to sort of show a little ingenuity. And I think Salam did that. So I don't know how many of you know this, but he went to Cambridge on a scholarship that was set up for the sons of farmers. And his father was not a landowner. But when they found out about the scholarship, because he was a brilliant student, they bought a small tract of land that technically qualified him for the to apply for the scholarship. Now, it's not like he was ripping anyone off, but he was giving himself that chance. It was still a competitive fellowship if he had a scholarship. If he hadn't been good enough, he wouldn't have gotten it. But he was able to, think about these little things of how do I get myself in? He had a question that he wanted to ask someone. He would just take the train down and go meet them immediately and work it out. So he did these little things where he gave himself the opportunity to succeed. Then there is this, which I think, again, someone asked him in that interview that I was referring to about what he feels straddling both physics and all his administrative duties. And he said, look, I wish I had more time for physics, obviously. I think I remember reading somewhere that Steven Weinberg said, well, Salam devotes so much of his time to the ICTP at the cost of physics, obviously, and I don't know that I would be able to do that. Salam made that decision, I think, partly because he knew that there is a burden or a responsibility that is conferred upon you at birth. And he wanted to discharge that as best he could. And this was something, he was uniquely positioned to do certain things. And he knew that if he didn't do them, they wouldn't get done. So there needs to be a certain acceptance of figuring out what it is that only you can do, and then just doing it wholeheartedly. And as a corollary to that, I think one of the reasons he was able to get so much done is that he was somehow able to not be bitter about all the things that he missed out on. So he missed out on publishing certain things. I don't know if he secretly felt bad about it till the end of his life, but he was able to use that and mold that into his life. He decided, okay, well, I will do things differently from now on. I think one of the biggest things he could have been bitter about was the way Pakistan treated him, which was awful. But he somehow was able to keep going back. He was able to do something which is very difficult. He was able to divorce a people and a government. he realized that the government had treated him shabbily, but not the people. There were still people who loved him. When his body went back for his funeral, just every road was lined with people. So many thousands had turned up to pay their respects. So that was not reflected in the government, obviously. But Salam had had a similar experience when he came back on the bicycle after receiving his matriculation result. And the entire village was out on the streets there to greet him. And that was significant because at that time, this was pre-partition India, and most of the shopkeepers were Hindus. And traditionally, the people who came first in the exams were generally Hindus as well. They were just more educated and they did better. So all these shopkeepers at a time when it was the afternoon, when their shops would have been closed, they all came out specially to pay a tribute to him and to acknowledge the fact that it was a son of their village. So they weren't, they didn't really care about the religious differences. They didn't say, oh, well, he's not a Sikh, he's not a Hindu, we're not going to go out and do this. So I think part of that attitude nurtured Salam's subsequent outlook as well, in that he remembered a time when there had been that sort of unity, and he always carried that within him. He realized that the people are still owed something even if the government reacts differently. Then there's this, which I also think is important, is to have some sort of a sense of fun. And apparently he had, I had never met him, but from everything I've read and heard, I mean, he apparently dressed up as a palmist for his daughter's school fair or something, and he just sat there and, read out fortunes. Or he had like a lot of light reading that he would do. And there were just like so many examples of, little anecdotes that I'm not going to go into because I know I'm running out of time. But again, the point is to have a sense of fun and to have some point where you unwind from whatever it is that you're doing. Then this is where I'm actually really regretting not having that quote accessible, because I think this is one of the most important things, is to have a tolerance for a multiplicity of viewpoints. And he had that. He had that in science. He had that, as far as religion was concerned, he had, because there was all of that science versus religion debate is apparently not a new thing. It's been going on forever. So there were, every single interview, people questioned him about that. And he was able to hold different viewpoints and not have them contradict each other. He was able to appreciate people who come from all sorts of different backgrounds and angles. And the quote that I wanted to read out was something about, he was very involved in developing science, in the cause of science in the developing countries. And he did a lot of work on that. He wrote almost what amount to research papers with all sorts of, the economics of it and numbers and huge tables and how things can be made better. So it was a very serious concern with him. And this is one of the things that he pointed to. He said, look, science flourishes when you are able to tolerate a multiplicity of views. You have to have that sort of atmosphere where people can throw out ideas and disagree and, then let the best idea survive. You have to have that. You have to have that innovation. So that, I think, is also a very important thing to recognize. Then, this I'm just going to skip over because I think it's kind of self-explanatory. But part of the dignity, I think, that he carried himself with, I think it also had to do with the fact that he felt bad about developing countries not necessarily contributing. So this is a common theme in almost all the writings of his that I read recently. When he said that the difference between the developing and the developed countries is that the developing countries keep importing technology and not contributing to science. And this was a pet peeve with him. He said it over and over again. And one of the things that he said was, look, you have to have a sense of dignity. You cannot keep consuming something that other people are putting together. You have to contribute to it in order to take your place on the world stage. And I think he was able to show that because science is remarkably equal in that way, in that people are judged for their ideas, not their accents, not what they look like, not where they come from. If an idea is good, people will listen to it. And he was able to show that if you push yourself forward, if you try and contribute to the subject or the discipline or the community that you're taking from, then it's a more equal relationship. Then you have some sort of dignity. And he felt very ashamed about that, which he said multiple times, that I don't want to belong to a group of people who are only taking and not giving. Again, he said it much better, but I have lost the quote. And then I just want to end with this. He said, again, it's part of the same, how do you move ahead? How do the developing countries move ahead? He said the last 100 years have seen nation after nation start with something like our conditions. This is a talk he gave in Pakistan, and crash through the poverty barrier. The laws governing this type of transformation are now well understood, which I think is also interesting because he took what was a social problem, he applied his scientific mind to it, and he broke down, he's had case studies of countries that had started in poverty and proceeded very rapidly to become developed. So he had a regular set of rules and laws that should be followed. And a lot of them have to do with obviously investing in science, but one very important thing is that you have to start contributing. You have to take your place in creating the content and not just acquiring it. And this, I think, given that he was one of the people who unified two very different forces, I just wanted to end with this quote, that at some point he said, this is obviously part of a longer thing, that he saw the joint endeavor in science being one of the unifying forces among the diverse people of the world. And again, I'm just taking a bit of poetic license here, but it almost makes me think of a gauge symmetry, as if you have science and you have this phase which just determines where you are on the globe. And that's all it is. It's a change of phase, really. And so if you all contribute to science, it could be the one thing that really ends up unifying you. It could be the one thing in which there is no need for there to be so many differences. And if you start out from that point of connection, then you find other connections as well. So this is something he said about the electroweak theory, again in this interview that I was quoting. He said, it's a good piece of work. Allah was very gracious in letting me get involved with something which inshallah will live. Inshallah means if God wills. So he said, I think he found some joy in the fact that it will live. It is one of those things which will continue. And even though he said, God was very gracious in letting me get involved with this, another thing that was completely his own... okay, we've lost that slide. That was completely his own thing, and it was not, the grace of God, was the ICTP. That is something that he personally got involved in. That is also something which will live. And I think we are seeing that it is almost like he created a model community. So that is the one place where science is a unifying force. And people from all over the world come and they make connections there. And those connections deepen and they become larger things. I studied at the ICTP for a year, almost 2 decades ago. I am still in touch, I know. I am still in touch with most of the people that I studied there with. And yes, a lot of us go abroad otherwise, but I don't know that I would have necessarily studied with someone from Mongolia, for instance. And a lot of us, we realized that even though we didn't have languages in common, we had so many problems and so many parts of our backgrounds were common, just in different languages, that I think it's a very important thing to have those connections, to have peers who can not only help you from a different viewpoint, but also equals who have similar problems and might have negotiated them in different ways. So I think that also is part of Salam's legacy as much as the electroweak theory. And I hope that will live, and I hope that will continue to unify people the way he was able to unify the forces.
Thank you, Tasneem. This was a very interesting and a very thoughtful and warm tribute to Abdus Salam. Thank you. Time for questions.
First, I have a comment. You mentioned tolerance. Tolerance is something which is very much valued in Singapore. So it's the right place to advocate that. And my question is, you probably know firsthand what was his attitude towards education in general, and especially education of women, which is a big problem in your region.
So I don't know that he specifically addressed the problem of women. I mean, I haven't found anything like that, but I like to think that he was. I like to think that that was almost not a concern, that was pretty much taken for granted. That seems to be borne out by the way he acted. Again, I never met him, so I don't know. But by all accounts, he was as encouraging of women as he was of men. I don't know that he addressed that separately. But as far as his concern with science education in general, he was so deeply concerned about it that, like I said, he wrote multiple papers, which literally qualify as research papers, and I think would have taken as much time. He has very, very detailed prescriptions and advice, and I think towards the end of his life, there were times when he said things which were he sounded disillusioned. That, I've been saying these same things for decades and nothing is really happening. I don't know when it will happen. So I think towards the end, he was beginning to feel a little disillusioned, but despite that, he kept at it. And every time he was asked to, turn up somewhere or be on some sort of committee or give a talk somewhere, he always did that. And I think that in his mind, science was the way out, for sure.
So could you tell us a little bit about what these recommendations were that he had for for Pakistan? And could you also tell us if the Pakistani government in 2016, if they've begun to take his ideas seriously?
Let me answer the second part of that first. I don't think so. Because I mean, it's shameful, but I think that in so many ways we are still where we were 50 years ago as far as the government is concerned. One of the things that Salam advocated, again, almost all of those papers are in that book that I saw outside, and they're very detailed. There was actually, he gave numbers and percentages. You should invest this much of your basic budget in sciences, this much in education. He really broke that down. It literally was a case-by-case analysis, and he came up with these laws. And again, one of the things was that teachers need to be, even university teachers, which is conventionally not the case in, I think, a lot of developing countries, definitely in Pakistan. Research isn't really encouraged, I should say. Teachers are just people who read what is already there and they teach. They just regurgitate. And he was he had a very strong opinion about that. He said, look, there is no way you can keep teaching something which is not alive to you. You have to take part in its creation. You have to be a part of that process. So one of his recommendations was that university teachers, at least, should have some exposure to research. And obviously their workload would need to be appropriately lightened in order to make that possible, and they would have to have the access to make that possible. So that was one recommendation. But there are just so many others. I think one of his other things, and the last one that I'll mention, is that he said the problem with developing countries is that every government that governments are very short-sighted, that people are only looking towards the end of their own tenure. Most of us don't have that wonderful rule where, president can only be there for so long, or you can only be re-elected twice. I mean, I grew up with the prime minister who was still a prime minister. He's been in and out of power, and it's just it's this game of, shuffling back and forth. Every few years, they're back again. It's like musical chairs. So 25, 30 years, these people have been in and out of power. And so they're constantly worried about getting re-elected, right? Now, when they're worried about that, they want to do things which are very obvious and in your face, and things that are tangible and will show immediately. So there's no long-term view. And which is why a lot of the governments are reluctant to put money into something as basic and vital as education because it just won't show in 4 years. You invest now, it's going to show 2-3 decades later. And unfortunately, that's still the case. I mean, you're talking of 2016. I was visiting Lahore, and which is a very historic city. It was a beautiful city. It's been, an important city in India and Pakistan since the time of the Mughals. There are all these beautiful monuments there. It's full of history. And a lot of those historical monuments, there's this huge movement going on right now, this civil movement, where people are protesting the fact that new roads are being built so close to those monuments that they might actually damage them. And some of these are World Heritage Sites. So there's this huge outcry. But the point is that the governments want roads built because roads are immediately visible, and suddenly they will get those votes. So that, again, is one of those things which, no, the government is not on board with, but he did advocate a longer-term view. And, that someone needs to let go of this business of do something that will show in 3 years.
Hi, thank you very much for that speech, very inspirational. For those of you who don't know, Abdul Salam is my father, so I know a little bit more about him than most people. In terms of the question about women, he did, when he set up the Third World Academy of Sciences, he set up the Third World Network of Women in Science as well, because he wanted to encourage women to come into science. My own sisters were persuaded. My eldest sister did her PhD in biochemistry and taught at Columbia University in New York. I have 3 sisters. The sister just above me was forced into doing physics and at A level, and she hated it. She wanted to do languages. And when there's a wonderful story which is in the press that some of you may have read, that when my father taught my sister physics, he taught all of us physics as well from a very young age. When she went to school and told her teacher, this is what my father's told me, she said, "Don't you dare put that into your exam paper, because if you do, you'll fail." And lo and behold, she did fail physics. And it was only then, when she failed her physics A-level, my father then relented and let her go back and do Southeast languages. 2 other very quick things. One is you talk about his language, his preference for the Punjabi, which is a language of the peasants, essentially. It's a very simple language, a very base language. When we were growing up, my father told my mother not to teach us Urdu, but to teach us Punjabi, because we were sons of the soil, he was a son of the soil, and we were not to have any pretenses of speaking this very flowery language, which is what Urdu is. And so he very much retained his roots. And the only other thing I'd say that you should perhaps talk about is also his inspiration from Islam.
Yes.
The culture and the history and the great figures who've passed through the ages in Islam, and of course the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, of Islam himself. With regards to your question about Pakistan, we don't have enough time, but I can give you lots of stories about what happened in Pakistan. And above all else, the hypocrisy of Pakistan.
Yes.
I have recently been going through my father's papers again, and even after he resigned of Chief Scientific Advisor in 1974, when he was made a second-class citizen in Pakistan because of his religion, and that's when he grew his beard. There's his own way of saying, "I am a Muslim. Muslim men wear beards," in the tradition of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and I'm a Muslim. But the Pakistan government never once invited him back to Pakistan until Zia was forced to, because Indira Gandhi invited him to India first. And then Zia was forced to invite him to Pakistan and pretend to make him a state guest.
Can I ask you a quick question? I heard about that incident that even though Indira Gandhi invited him first and then Zia invited him, he still made it a point to go to Pakistan first.
Absolutely. As you said, there's no bitterness in him, which again is the model of Islam, is what the Quran teaches us, no bitterness or resentment. But the point I was going to make was that every scientific person in Pakistan still came to him wherever he was in the world to ask for his advice. And I can show you hundreds of letters and papers he wrote for Pakistan after he had left to try and get them to change. And he gave one simple fact, and bearing in mind what you talked about in terms of statistics, the Pakistan gives 25% of its budget to defense. He wanted Pakistan to increase from 1% into education to 3% into education. And that was the change that he wanted. He believed that would create a sustainable growth model. I won't take up any more time, but I'm here for the next 2 days if anyone wants to talk
No,
about
thank
my
you.
father.
And thank you also for saying that about women in science, because that was my gut instinct always. I thought that he would be, but I'd never come across anything. I hadn't seen anything written. So it's really good to know that. Thank you.
So let's thank Tasneem again. A very nice talk. And also the questions and the follow-up.